Daniel Carter still remembered the first time he and his wife, Heather, drove through the gentle curves of Maplewood Grove. It was a perfect late spring afternoon, new leaves unfurling, lawns dappled with the soft glow of a setting sun, and an almost storybook calm that hovered over the neighborhood. Every porch seemed carefully maintained, every flower bed tidy, and a distinct hush lingered under the canopy of well-groomed trees. Wow, Heather had breathed, her hand resting on Daniel's shoulder as he maneuvered the car along Maplewood Lane. It's exactly like those picture postcard neighborhoods in real estate brochures. Daniel nodded, a little in awe himself. He wasn't used to such pristine order in a suburb. Growing up, his own neighborhood had been a bit more eclectic. Bicycles strewn on sidewalks, mismatched fences, dogs barking at odd hours. This new development felt almost too perfect, but the real estate agent had assured them that was precisely the point. Maplewood Grove was governed by an HOA that prided itself on exacting standards. They pulled up to the modest two-story house that would soon become their home. Pale blue siding, a neat white picket fence, a small but well-maintained yard. It wasn't flashy, but it felt welcoming. And for Daniel and Heather, newly minted parents of a 1-year-old baby girl named Lily, safety and neighborly calm were top priorities. As they parked, the agent highlighted various selling points: the short walk to a neighborhood park, the quiet cul-de-sac location, and, of course, the HOA's excellent reputation for keeping the area secure and well-kept. Heather and Daniel exchanged a look, thinking that everything sounded ideal. At the time, the notion of a homeowners association seemed helpful. Someone else would handle routine matters, ensuring property values stayed healthy. They both shrugged off the typical jokes about HOA tyranny. How strict could it really be? "We'll sign," Daniel said, voice brimming with confidence. The Carters moved in a few weeks later. The house came fully inspected, with minimal fixes required. On the day the moving truck arrived, neighbors poked their heads out, offering the occasional wave. It was quiet but friendly enough. Daniel felt an immediate sense of relief. So far, Maplewood Grove matched the idyllic image he and Heather had craved for Lily's first home. Little did they know that amid this tranquil perfection, a storm named Arlene Brewster lurked. Most neighbors privately called her Karen, an unflattering nickname she had earned by perpetually demanding to speak to the manager and lecturing others with righteous entitlement. Karen was a somewhat tall, middle-aged woman with silver-streaked hair, a pinched expression, and a clipboard almost permanently attached to her arm. When she walked, she did so with brisk, loud steps that implied she had important business to conduct, even if all she was doing was sizing up a neighbor's grass height. For the first couple of weeks, Daniel and Heather had only heard rumors of Karen, stories told in hushed tones by other residents. She was the president of Maplewood Grove's HOA, respected by a few rule-loving folks but quietly dreaded by most. If a hedge overshot the official regulated height by so much as a fraction of an inch, one could expect a stiffly worded notice on the doorstep. If a child's bicycle was left lying on the sidewalk, there'd be an immediate fine. They said she knew the rulebook by heart and had personally annotated half of it. Just a bit of an enforcer. An elderly neighbor named Mrs. Tyndall said delicately, handing Heather a tray of cookies as a welcome gift. "She does keep the place spotless, but she can be, well, overly involved." Heather offered a polite smile. "I'm sure we'll be fine," she said. "We don't plan on any wild parties or anything like that." Mrs. Tyndall simply nodded, lips tightening. "Just be careful. She'll find something to fixate on if she feels like it." Daniel didn't think much of it. Both he and Heather preferred a peaceful life, rarely doing anything that might ruffle feathers. They kept their yard clean, put out the trash on time, and ensured Lily's toys were stowed away. It all seemed straightforward. But as they were about to learn, sometimes in Maplewood Grove, the simplest acts could light the fuse of Karen's indignation. And once lit, that fuse was almost impossible to snuff out without a spectacle. One bright Saturday morning, Daniel found himself hanging a small bird feeder in the yard. It was an inexpensive wooden model, purchased at a home goods store, that promised to attract local songbirds, robins, finches, maybe a cheerful cardinal or two. He'd always imagined Lily would love watching colorful birds from the safety of the living room window, her tiny hands pressed against the glass. He whistled softly as he adjusted the hook on the tree branch. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves overhead. Suddenly, A sharp voice cut through the morning calm. "You there? New neighbor." Daniel turned, startled. Striding up the sidewalk was a woman about his mother's age, wearing tailored khaki pants, a crisp blouse, and a confident scowl. Her short, steel-gray hair framed her face in a no-nonsense bob. She clutched a clipboard emblazoned with the HOA's logo. "Yes? Can I help you?" he asked, stepping down from the small step stool. He extended a friendly hand. "I'm Daniel Carter. We just moved in." She ignored the gesture, eyes fixed on the newly hung feeder. "I'm Arlene Brewster," she said flatly. "HOA board president. I noticed you were installing a bird feeder. Are you aware of the restrictions?" Daniel blinked. "Restrictions?" Karen, as he would come to call her in his head, pursed her lips. "We have regulations about bird feeders attracting non-native birds or causing noise and droppings that could affect neighbors. Some feeders bring pigeons, and that's unacceptable. You'll have to watch for that." "Oh," Daniel said. "I hadn't thought about pigeons, but we're mostly hoping for songbirds. I'm sure it'll be fine." Karen sniffed, tapping her pen on the clipboard. "We'll see. If it becomes a nuisance, you'll hear from me." And with that, she gave a curt nod and left, her footsteps clicking briskly on the sidewalk. Daniel stood there, somewhat taken aback. The entire exchange had been cold and officious, a far cry from the warm welcomes they'd received from other neighbors. It was only his first real interaction with Karen, but he already felt the undercurrent of tension that others had warned him about. He went inside to tell Heather, who was simultaneously alarmed and amused. "Well, I guess we just met the infamous Karen," she said, cradling Lily on her hip. "Let's keep an eye on the birds, but I doubt it'll be a problem." They laughed it off, unaware that Karen's meddling would soon escalate. In the following weeks, Daniel and Heather continued to settle in. Heather planted flowers along the walkway. Nothing extravagant, just a few pots of geraniums and marigolds. One afternoon, a note appeared in their mailbox. "Please limit floral arrangements to no more than 3 potted plants per entryway. Refer to Section 8.3.1 of the HOA guidelines." It was typed, but had the telltale dryness of Karen's diction. "Wow, she doesn't waste any time," Daniel mumbled, showing Heather the note. She rolled her eyes. "She's going to be a handful, isn't she?" Daniel nodded. "Maybe. We'll stick to the rules and hopefully keep a low profile." They had no idea that soon, even their best intentions would fail spectacularly in the face of Karen's overbearing nature. It only took one child's playful chalk drawing to set off an explosive neighborhood saga. The spark that ignited the controversy was a whimsical idea Daniel had one sunny Saturday afternoon. Lily, by now a wobbly 1-year-old, had begun toddling around the living room, pulling herself up on furniture, taking tentative steps toward any colorful object. Daniel wanted to encourage her progress in a fun, engaging way. Maybe something that combined art, motion, and imagination. He recalled a memory from his own childhood, sidewalk chalk. His mother used to let him draw stick figure families and hopscotch boards on the driveway. It was inexpensive and non-permanent, a perfect form of creative play. A thought struck him. What if I make a chalk maze for Lily, something she can walk through slowly, following colorful lines, shapes, and arrows? Delighted by the prospect, he drove to a nearby store and returned with a jumbo box of chalk in vivid pinks, blues, yellows, and greens. After positioning Lily in a shaded spot on the driveway, he got to work. First, he sketched a broad, curved line, looping back on itself to form a spiral. Then he added little arrows, swirl motifs, and comedic stick figure animals. It stretched from the garage door out to the sidewalk and around the big oak tree at the edge of their property. Heather peered out from the front window, smiling as she saw bright colors popping up across the concrete. She stepped outside, Lily balanced on her hip. "This is adorable," she exclaimed, nudging Lily's tiny hand so she could point. "Can't wait to see her reaction." Daniel made a final flourish with a piece of turquoise chalk, writing in large, playful letters, "Lily's Maze." Then he stood, brushing dust from his palms, and turned to invite Lily. The toddler's eyes lit up as she reached a shaky foot toward the swirling pink line. She let out a high-pitched squeal of delight. Heather laughed, setting her down carefully, and Lily began toddling, following Daniel's guiding hands. The colorful chalk lines made the world more interesting, encouraging her to take a few more steps, stop to investigate, then carry on. Daniel felt an inexplicable joy bubbling up, seeing how something so simple could spark Lily's sense of wonder. Neighbors ambled by, drawn by the rainbow patterns. Mrs. Tyndall paused on her morning walk, smiling widely. A mother with 2 older kids stopped, and soon those children grabbed spare pieces of chalk to add flowers and stars. Everyone who passed seemed charmed. It was a heartwarming scene, a father using the sidewalk to create a small realm of magic for his child. Then, a hush fell over a few onlookers. Daniel sensed it before he heard it, the crisp click of footsteps on the pavement, the staccato beat of an approaching storm. He looked up to see Karen in the distance, wearing a pressed blouse, slacks, and an unmistakable scowl. A chill coursed through Daniel. For an instant, he thought, surely she won't have a problem with a baby's chalk drawing, right? He couldn't have been more wrong. Karen reached the edge of the driveway, her gaze locked on the multicolored swirls that now adorned the concrete. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Daniel forced a friendly smile. "Hello," he called. "We're—" "Stop," Karen said, a single word of command that made Daniel's greeting falter. She planted her hands on her hips, surveying the chalk lines. "This is unauthorized." Other neighbors, who had seen Karen's approach, lingered at a cautious distance. They'd witnessed her enforcement of petty regulations often enough to sense trouble brewing. Heather instinctively shielded Lily, who remained oblivious to the tension, batting at a butterfly that had landed nearby. "Unauthorized," Daniel repeated, trying not to sound defensive. "It's just chalk art for my daughter. I didn't paint anything permanently. It'll wash away with rain." HOA guidelines prohibit defacement of public walkways, Karen snapped, pointing her clipboard at the portion of the maze that extended onto the sidewalk. "Your driveway is private property, but that sidewalk belongs to the neighborhood. This is absolutely not allowed without prior permission." Daniel felt his shoulders tighten. "I don't think chalk is considered defacement. It's not damaging anything. Kids everywhere do it." Karen's nostrils flared. "If every child decided to decorate the sidewalks," she said, voice dripping with scorn, "Maplewood Grove would be covered in scribbles. We have standards here. If you want your baby to do her baby games, keep them in your own yard or inside your home." A flicker of anger sparked in Daniel. Baby games. He glanced around for support. Some neighbors seemed conflicted, unsure whether to intervene. A handful shot apologetic or angry looks in Karen's direction. "Look," Daniel said, attempting a level tone, "it's harmless. The HOA guidelines don't specifically say no sidewalk chalk. There's no permanent damage or inconvenience." Karen scoffed. "I've read the entire document. Defacement or modification of public property is not allowed. It's an eyesore and a safety risk if people slip on chalk dust. Remove it now." Before Daniel could formulate a reply, Karen strode forward with abrupt aggression. In a stunning display of pettiness, she brought her foot down on the chalk lines with deliberate force. Her loafers smeared pink and yellow arcs into muddy smudges. She walked back and forth, scuffing the once joyful swirl into an indistinct blur of pale chalk and footprints. Lily, startled by the sudden commotion, began to fuss, her lower lip trembling. "Stop, hey!" Daniel exclaimed, rushing to scoop up Lily. "You're destroying it on purpose?" Karen flung him a withering glare. "You're not listening. This belongs inside. I won't have Maplewood Grove looking like a carnival. Do that inside." Her voice rose to an unhinged pitch, echoing off nearby houses. Several neighbors gasped, some snapping quick photos on their phones. Heather took Lily from Daniel, hugging the toddler, who now openly cried at the harsh yelling. Visibly shaking with anger, Daniel took a moment to breathe. "That was uncalled for," he said through gritted teeth. "You frightened my daughter." Karen gave a disdainful shrug. "I'm enforcing the rules. Don't test me again." And with that, she pivoted and stomped away, leaving behind a surreal tableau. A few stunned neighbors, a partially destroyed chalk maze, and Daniel's family grappling with the aftershock of the confrontation. In that moment, something galvanized in Daniel. He looked at Heather, who gently soothed Lily. Their daughter's tears felt like a personal attack. He saw the smears of bright color on the concrete, realized how quickly Karen had trampled on an innocent joy, and felt the slow burn of righteous anger kindling in his chest. He had no idea that many of his neighbors felt the same, that Karen's meltdown had lit a collective spark of rebellion that would soon set Maplewood Grove ablaze in pastel chalk. News of Karen's tantrum raced through Maplewood Grove faster than a summer wind. Photos and short video clips capturing Karen stomping across the chalk, shouting, "Do that inside," appeared on neighborhood group chats and private social media circles. The footage was both shocking and absurd, an HOA president practically waging war against a toddler's chalk art. Daniel, busy comforting Lily and helping Heather settle her nerves, hadn't fully realized the extent of the incident's reach until late that evening. His phone buzzed nonstop with notifications from neighbors, some he'd never formally met, offering support and voicing indignation at Karen's behavior. A few senior residents, who rarely ventured out, even called to express their outrage that a simple child's play could be targeted with such hostility. Meanwhile, in living rooms and on porches across Maplewood Grove, residents shared stories of their own run-ins with Karen. One man recalled being cited for unauthorized ornamental lighting after he put up string lights on his porch for a birthday party. A young couple recounted how Karen scolded them for leaving their trash bin at the curb for too long on pickup day. A mother told how Karen once threatened to fine her for having too many flower pots on her balcony, detrimental to property values, Karen had written. The photos of Karen's chalk stomping seemed to crystallize a widespread sentiment that her leadership of the HOA had gone from strict to tyrannical. People spoke of "enough is enough," the phrase repeated so often in group messages that it became a rallying cry. By the next afternoon, a small gathering formed spontaneously in front of the Carter's house. Daniel, initially wary of large crowds, stepped out onto his porch to find half a dozen neighbors holding boxes of sidewalk chalk, wearing determined expressions. An older gentleman, Mr. Gonzalez, adjusted his reading glasses. "We'd like your permission to, color your driveway again," he said gently, "and maybe a bit more." Daniel's eyebrows lifted. "All of that for Lily? Also for ourselves," a teenage girl piped up. "We've put up with Karen's nonsense for years. It's time for something cheerful that shows we stand together." Heather, holding Lily, emerged behind Daniel. "We don't want anyone to get in trouble," she said, scanning the group. A middle-aged neighbor, Miss Porter, shrugged. "If she's going to punish one of us, she'll have to punish all of us. Besides, it's chalk, not graffiti." Touched, Daniel nodded. "Go for it," he said, stepping aside and waving them toward the driveway and sidewalk. "It's your neighborhood too." In a burst of collective creativity, people spread out, chalk in hand, adding new lines and shapes that extended far beyond Daniel's original design. They painted labyrinths that curved around the mailbox and even spilled gently into the street's edge, still leaving room for cars to pass safely. Children drew flowers, suns, and hearts. Some parents added words of encouragement: "Stand together, we support Lily," and even comedic caricatures of Karen's recognizable silhouette, though Daniel was unsure about the wisdom of that. As dusk arrived, the chalkers switched on portable lanterns and phone flashlights, continuing their artwork by the glow of street lamps. Daniel found himself handing out lemonade cups from his kitchen, while Heather offered brownies to keep everyone's energy up. It felt festive, like an impromptu block party. People who barely knew each other traded jokes and stories. The tension that Karen had sown seemed to bring everyone closer together in an act of defiance and solidarity. By midnight, a massive chalk tapestry adorned the street. It was not just Lily's maze anymore. It was an explosion of color that united half the block. "I can't wait to see Karen's face in the morning," Miss Porter said with a mischievous smile. Others grinned in agreement, although Daniel couldn't help feeling a pang of worry. Karen won't just fume. She'll fight back, he thought, hugging Heather protectively. What will happen next? But for that night, the Carters and their neighbors slept with a sense of triumph. No matter what the HOA president did next, Maplewood Grove had crossed a threshold. A new spirit of fellowship had arrived, personified in a rainbow of chalk on previously uniform gray concrete. The next morning, Maplewood Grove awoke to a spectacle. The entire length of sidewalk in front of Daniel's house was now a kaleidoscope of pastel shapes, doodles, and words of encouragement. Curious passers-by slowed their cars, some even parking to step out and admire the accidental community art gallery. Children from different blocks pestered their parents to bring them so they could see or add their own chalk contributions. Daniel stood at his window, sipping coffee, half in awe of what had transpired. The previous night's artistic flurry had transformed the quiet cul-de-sac into a vibrant hub of neighborly camaraderie. Several random strangers had already ambled up the driveway, offering compliments or shyly asking if they could add a small drawing. And then came Karen. She marched down the sidewalk, her posture rigid, her mouth set in a furious line. Her phone was in her hand, camera lens pointed, as though collecting visual evidence of a crime scene. Daniel saw her snapping photo after photo, presumably to use at the next HOA meeting. A few onlookers parted like the Red Sea when she approached, unwilling to engage in a shouting match. For a moment, Karen locked eyes with Daniel through the living room window. He considered waving, but her glare was so hostile that he quickly decided otherwise. She pivoted and stormed off, barked something into her phone, and vanished around the corner. Daniel's phone rang soon afterward. It was Ms. Porter, calling from 2 streets over. "She's demanding an emergency HOA board meeting," Ms. Porter said breathlessly. "I'm on the board's email list. She wants it today." "What does that mean for us?" Daniel asked, a leaden feeling in his stomach. "She's calling it a discussion of neighborhood vandalism and standards violations. It's probably about your chalk labyrinth. Or ours, I should say." Ms. Porter's voice wavered between worry and defiance. "We'll attend in force to defend you. Hang tight." Sure enough, that afternoon, a notice appeared on the Maplewood Grove online portal. Emergency HOA meeting at 5 p.m. in the community center. Residents braced for a showdown. Rumors flew that Karen was planning to levy fines or even threaten legal action. Others whispered that some board members were fed up with Karen's authoritarian approach and that this incident might be her undoing. By 4:50 p.m., the community center's modest meeting room was packed. Daniel and Heather arrived with Lily. Though Daniel had half a mind to keep her home, he felt it was important to stand as a family. Familiar faces nodded and waved as they entered, offering encouragement. The tension in the air was thick enough to slice with a knife. At 5 p.m. sharp, Karen called the meeting to order. She stood behind a small podium, flanked by the other HOA board members who seemed uneasy, as though they feared a public relations crisis. The hush in the room was deafening. Karen cleared her throat, scanning the crowd with disapproval. "This emergency session is to address a serious breach of Maplewood Grove's regulations concerning defacement of common property," she announced, her voice echoing in the microphone. "Particularly, unauthorized markings on sidewalks and potential hazards resulting from these actions." A murmur of disbelief rippled through the assembled neighbors. Daniel felt Heather grip his hand. Lily, perched in his arms, made soft cooing noises, oblivious to the drama. Karen continued, "I have documented extensive chalk graffiti on the sidewalk in front of Mr. Carter's home and in surrounding areas. This cannot be allowed to continue. The rules are clear. Public walkways cannot be modified or defaced for private use. The HOA must maintain order and decorum, so property values remain stable." "Property values?" someone blurted. "It's chalk that washes away." Karen shot a glare toward the source of the outburst. "We will have a civil discussion," she snapped. "Let's remember the real issue at stake, preserving the uniformity and safety of our neighborhood." She then waved a stack of photos. From a distance, Daniel recognized the chalk labyrinth. He also saw snapshots of neighbors adding designs and kids playing hopscotch. Karen's voice tightened. "I propose an immediate directive. Remove all chalk drawings from the sidewalks or face monetary fines for each day the markings remain." At that, a small uproar broke out. Several parents began speaking over one another, citing the harmless nature of chalk. Others raised questions about the specific language in the HOA guidelines. Some demanded to know why Karen had confronted a toddler so aggressively. The meeting threatened to descend into chaos. The other board members looked uncomfortable. Finally, Ms. Harper, the board's treasurer, raised her hand for silence. "Let's be systematic," she said. "We should hear from the neighbors involved. Mr. Carter, would you like to speak?" Daniel's heart thudded, but he steadied himself, passing Lily to Heather. He rose and approached the microphone. The audience quieted. "My daughter, Lily, just started walking," he began, voice carrying a mix of nerves and resolution. "I drew the initial chalk maze on my own driveway to encourage her to move around. A small portion extended onto the sidewalk. I didn't think it violated any rules. Chalk is temporary." Then Karen showed up, stomped on the maze, and yelled at us. Lily was so scared she cried. A wave of sympathy murmured through the crowd. Daniel continued. Neighbors stepped in to show support. They added more chalk art, not just for Lily, but to create a sense of community. There's no permanent damage. If a simple rain shower comes, it'll vanish. So why is the HOA treating this as vandalism? He glanced at Karen, who watched with narrowed eyes. We're just trying to be good neighbors, raising our child in a fun, safe environment, Daniel concluded. I believe the real harm here was Karen's hostility, not the chalk drawings. The audience erupted in scattered applause. Karen's cheeks flushed. She gripped the edges of the podium. Order, she shouted, banging a gavel that sat by her side. This is exactly the sort of emotional appeal that undermines the rules. It's not about the child. It's about all children thinking they can do this. Where does it end? From the back of the room, Mr. Gonzalez stood. If you're so worried about sidewalk appearances, he said pointedly, maybe you should worry about scaring residents away with your aggression. That'll hurt property values more than pastel chalk. Laughter and applause rippled around the room. Karen glowered. Another board member, Ms. Jones, lifted her notes. We've had many complaints about the manner in which this was handled, she said carefully. Destroying a child's chalk drawing was extreme. I suggest we postpone immediate fines and instead consider revising the rules about non-permanent decorations. Karen all but snarled, leaning into the microphone. This is not the board's official stance. A hush fell as Ms. Harper, the treasurer, cleared her throat. Actually, the board has to vote on any official action. And by the looks of it, she scanned the table of members, many of whom refused to meet Karen's gaze. We're not in unanimous agreement. Karen turned red with fury. Then we'll table the matter until the next meeting, she snapped. But rest assured, the chalk fiasco will be addressed. With that, she slammed the gavel again, signaling the meeting's abrupt end. People rose from their seats, some incensed, others elated that Karen's motion for immediate fines had stalled. Over the buzz of conversation, Daniel felt a sense of cautious relief. They had won a small battle, but the war was far from over. Outside the community center, neighbors clustered around Daniel, offering supportive words. I'll help keep that chalk art fresh if she tries to wipe it out again, a teenage boy promised. No way is she bullying a toddler, a father of two added. For a moment, Maplewood Grove felt less like a collection of houses and more like a unified neighborhood standing up for itself. Karen might have left the meeting with her authority bruised, but Daniel suspected she'd retaliate. And he was right. Her next move was already in motion. In the days after the contentious HOA meeting, Maplewood Grove's chalk-laden sidewalks turned into an unexpected tourist attraction within the larger town. It started with photos posted in a local parenting Facebook group. Images of the whimsical labyrinth, the swirling designs, and the humorous notes referencing Karen. Curious families living outside Maplewood Grove began driving by just to witness the colorful spectacle and snap pictures of their kids walking the chalk paths. Some neighbors worried about cars slowing or stopping near the intersection, but overall, the vibe remained cheerful. People parked responsibly, greeted local residents politely, and even brought their own chalk to add new sections. One evening, Daniel returned from work to find a young mother sketching a giant sunflower on the sidewalk. She introduced herself, explained she was from the next town over, and said she'd read about the chalk labyrinth controversy online. I thought it was such a sweet act of community, she told Daniel. No way should that be shut down. Meanwhile, Karen patrolled the neighborhood, phone in hand, snapping photos of every new drawing. She confronted out-of-towners, demanding they cease unauthorized modifications to Maplewood Grove property. Often, they ignored her or hastily left, confused by her hostility. Each day, new chalk designs appeared, only fueling Karen's fury. In an effort to regain control, Karen emailed the city's Department of Public Works, framing the chalk art as dangerous, unauthorized street art. An inspector eventually showed up. He walked the sidewalks, shaking his head when he saw kids laughing as they hopped between chalk shapes. Looks harmless to me, he told Daniel with a shrug. Chalk washes away. We typically don't intervene unless it's permanent paint or truly obstructing foot traffic. I'll file a report, but don't worry about it. Karen's complaint got nowhere, which only enraged her further. She doubled down with the HOA, pressing them to draft new language banning chalk on public walkways. But at the next informal board discussion, multiple members refused to sign off, fearing a backlash. We're a family neighborhood, Ms. Jones said. Banning chalk drawings will make us look ridiculous. While Karen fought that losing battle, the neighborhood continued to blossom with pastel hues. Some resourceful teens began turning the labyrinth into an ever-evolving puzzle, adding numbered checkpoints and secret passageways to connect different loops. A group of local artists offered to create chalk murals at intervals, turning Maplewood Grove's sidewalks into a living gallery. Daniel watched all of this unfold with a mixture of gratitude and amazement. A simple project he'd done for Lily was now the catalyst for a community rally that transcended petty HOA rules. The local newspaper, the Maplewood Gazette, sent a reporter. The article that emerged, Chalk Showdown. When an HOA versus toddlers maze goes viral, painted Karen in an unflattering light, describing how she had furiously stomped on a toddler's art project. The piece included quotes from neighbors who called the labyrinth a neighborhood unifier and pure fun. The journalist attempted to get Karen's side of the story, but she declined to comment, leaving only a terse email statement. Rules exist for a reason. Within days, the story spread, with small local TV stations picking it up. A wave of community support poured in from beyond Maplewood Grove. While many readers chuckled at the idea of an HOA meltdown over chalk, others expressed admiration for the solidarity shown by the neighborhood. A handful of families even took to donating chalk in bulk, leaving boxes on Daniel's porch with notes like, "Keep coloring Lily." Each new gesture chipped away at Karen's authority. Residents who had felt bullied by her for years realized her power was not absolute. If they stuck together and appealed to common sense, her threats lost much of their sting. Some spoke openly of wanting to revisit the HOA's leadership structure. Even longtime supporters of Karen began questioning whether her methods were too extreme, potentially hurting Maplewood Grove's reputation more than a few chalk drawings ever could. For Daniel, life grew paradoxically more complicated and yet more joyful. On the one hand, he worried about backlash. Karen still wielded power to issue fines or single them out in other ways. On the other hand, he was astonished by the outpouring of kindness from so many corners. Lily was walking more confidently each day, giggling as she explored new chalk shapes. It was heartwarming to see neighbors forging friendships over something as innocent as sidewalk art. Nevertheless, Daniel felt sure Karen would not retreat quietly, and in that, he was absolutely correct. When the day of the official monthly HOA meeting arrived, 2 weeks after the chaotic emergency session, the atmosphere around Maplewood Grove felt electric. By then, the chalk labyrinth had grown even more elaborate, with side annexes created by bored teenagers and a few visiting artists from local schools. Karen's hostility had peaked. She'd been seen on more than one occasion gesturing wildly at any passerby who dared to pick up a chalk stick. One neighbor's Ring doorbell camera even caught her muttering threats about calling the cops if this nonsense didn't stop. But behind her back, the board members circulated an agenda that included a public hearing segment on the chalk art controversy. Residents took it as an invitation to show up in force, ready to voice their opinions and fight for their right to keep the labyrinth, at least until the elements washed it away naturally. The meeting convened in the same community center, but this time, the crowd was even bigger. People squeezed into folding chairs arranged in rows, with some forced to stand along the walls. Daniel arrived early, anxious to find a seat for Heather and Lily. He spotted Ms. Porter, Ms. Jones, Mr. Gonzalez, and others he recognized, all wearing resolute expressions. Promptly at 7 p.m., Karen, in a stiff pastel suit, took her seat at the head of the table. A hush fell over the crowd. Though she attempted to look composed, Daniel noticed a twitch at the corner of her mouth, a sign of simmering anger or nerves. Miss Harper, the treasurer, cleared her throat. "Let's open with old business first," she said, reading from the agenda. "Then we'll address the new business item titled Sidewalk Usage and Chalk Art." With each mundane item checked off, fence height approvals, discussion of landscaping budgets, updates on seasonal decorations, the audience grew more restless. At last, Ms. Harper turned to the final entry. "Next on the agenda is the matter of sidewalk chalk drawings. We'll allow public comment." Karen tried to seize control. "Before we open the floor, I'd like to make a statement," she said. Without waiting for permission, she launched into a prepared speech about maintaining Maplewood Grove's integrity, referencing vague statistics about property values and citing a litany of examples of neighborhoods that allegedly declined due to uncontrolled visuals. She painted a grim picture, as though a rainbow of chalk was the slippery slope to total anarchy. As she spoke, people shifted in their seats, exchanging eye rolls and stifling scoffs. Once she finished, Ms. Harper signaled for public comment. The next hour was a deluge of passionate speeches from neighbors. A young mother spoke of how the chalk art brought joy to her children, encouraging outdoor play and community engagement. A retired teacher praised the chalk drawings as a form of neighborhood public art that promoted unity. A local small business owner argued that Karen's extreme approach could scare off potential homebuyers more than colorful sidewalks ever would. Teens and kids shyly explained how they loved contributing to the giant maze, describing how it made them feel proud and connected. Then came Daniel's turn. He kept his remarks concise, reiterating how it all began for Lily, how neighbors spontaneously joined, and how punishing them for ephemeral chalk art was both unfair and counterproductive to the spirit of Maplewood Grove. "I never wanted a fight," he said, voice steady. "But we can't ignore the sense of community that's grown because of this. If we lose that, we lose something priceless." A wave of applause followed his words. Karen sat there, stony-faced, gripping her pen as though it might snap. When the board convened to vote on whether to enact a ban on sidewalk chalk or impose fines, the tension in the room felt overwhelming. Ms. Harper announced the result. For votes against the ban, 1 vote in favor, Karen's. The measure failed. The labyrinth would remain, at least until it naturally washed away or neighbors chose to remove it. The room erupted in cheers. Daniel exhaled, feeling Heather's hand on his shoulder and Lily wiggling happily in her arms. People clapped each other on the back, smiling widely. Karen, humiliated and furious, slammed her papers together and stormed out. A wave of murmured commentary followed her exit. "Good riddance," someone muttered. In that moment, it seemed like the tide had turned. Maplewood Grove had put its foot down on Karen's attempts to micromanage harmless fun. And yet, Daniel couldn't shake a feeling that Karen, wounded by this defeat, would not simply accept it. She had invested years molding Maplewood Grove into her personal fiefdom. Could one chalk labyrinth truly end her reign, or was she already plotting her next move? In the weeks that followed, Maplewood Grove experienced something akin to a cultural renaissance. Residents found themselves lingering in front yards, chatting more with neighbors they once only nodded to in passing. The chalk labyrinth was mostly intact, though occasional rain showers smudged or faded sections. Each time that happened, new designs, jokes, or messages sprang up, some in defiance of Karen, others simply celebrating everyday life. An elderly woman named Ms. Caldwell, who rarely left her house, started placing small bowls of wrapped candy on her porch for the kids who came by to see the chalk. When asked why, she shrugged and said, "It's nice to have visitors. I never realized how quiet it was before." A retiree who used to keep to himself began offering free cups of lemonade to passers-by. "I used to think nobody cared, that we just lived in our own boxes," he told Daniel one afternoon. "But after seeing everyone rally together over something so simple, I realized we can be a real community." Even the local paper followed up with a second article. Maplewood Grove's chalk labyrinth continues to build bridges. The tone was celebratory. The labyrinth had become a kind of metaphor, proof that shared creativity and kindness could overcome pettiness and arbitrary constraints. Meanwhile, Karen's presence around the neighborhood became sporadic. She still lived in her house on Applewood Drive, but she rarely prowled the streets as she once did. Rumor had it that even her staunch supporters on the HOA board suggested she take time off to reflect on the fiasco and avoid further conflicts that might damage the HOA's reputation. She was still officially the president, but her authority had taken a blow. Some neighbors whispered that at the next election, she'd be voted out for sure. Daniel's personal life felt lighter. Lily, now toddling with more confidence, lit up whenever she saw other kids playing near the sidewalk. Heather, initially nervous about raising a child in a heavily regulated suburb, relaxed into the knowledge that they had allies. The Carters found themselves invited to more block parties and spontaneous barbecues than they could attend. One afternoon, while Heather was out grocery shopping, Daniel let Lily toddle in the front yard, heading toward the chalk shapes that still adorned the driveway. A sudden movement caught his eye. Karen, stepping onto the sidewalk. She froze for a moment, seeing Daniel. Her expression was hard to read, something between resignation and resentment. He tensed, expecting a confrontation. But all Karen did was give a curt nod, then continue walking, carefully skirting the chalk lines. It was the closest thing to a peace gesture he'd ever received from her. He recalled how she'd once threatened them with fines and defacement notices. Maybe she's realized she can't win this battle, he thought. Or maybe she was simply waiting for a chance to strike again. Regardless, Daniel let out a silent sigh of relief. Lily giggled, oblivious to the passing figure. And for now, that was enough. The labyrinth thrived, the neighbors flourished, and Karen's stance seemed to be fading into the background. A month later, a series of summer thunderstorms rolled through town. One evening, lightning flickered across the sky, thunder rattled windows, and a torrential downpour battered the roofs of Maplewood Grove. By dawn, much of the chalk artwork was streaked or completely washed away, leaving only faint pastel traces on the sidewalks. Daniel and Heather observed the changed scenery with bittersweet emotions. The labyrinth, once so vibrant, was now little more than blurred outlines and puddles tinted with ephemeral color. They found themselves remembering the day Lily first set foot on the chalk path, wobbly yet determined, and the day Karen stomped on that same path in a fit of rage. So much had happened in those intervening weeks. Heartbreak, community solidarity, an explosion of creativity, and a re-examination of Maplewood Grove's identity. Word spread quickly that the labyrinth was almost gone. Neighbors came by, some with cameras, to snap farewell photos, capturing the final ghostly images of the chalk. A few kids tried to redraw sections, but the soggy ground made it difficult. Perhaps it was time to let nature reclaim the sidewalk, allowing the memory of the labyrinth to live on in stories and pictures. However, the true transformation, the more permanent kind, had already taken root. People now greeted each other on morning walks. Children played freely, unafraid that an overzealous HOA president would appear to scold them for normal, harmless fun. The board, emboldened by the residents' pushback, began examining old rules to see which ones were genuinely beneficial and which were stifling. Petty infractions like porch decorations or tiny yard signs were de-emphasized in favor of real issues such as street safety and communal improvements. When the next official HOA election cycle arrived, Karen found herself challenged by a well-liked neighbor named Ms. Porter. The campaign was civil but decisive. Ms. Porter promised a balanced approach to maintaining Maplewood Grove's beauty without sacrificing spontaneity. Karen, meanwhile, clung to her argument that strict control is necessary, but the labyrinth fiasco had tarnished her image. On election day, Ms. Porter won by a large margin. Karen was removed from the presidency, though she remained a homeowner in the neighborhood. Some speculated she might eventually move away, but she didn't. At least not immediately. Daniel and Heather, for their part, chose not to celebrate Karen's downfall publicly. They understood that everyone made mistakes, and that perhaps, in her own strict, misguided way, Karen believed she was protecting the neighborhood. Yet her methods had been cruel and excessive, particularly that day she'd stomped on Lily's chalk maze. No apology ever came from Karen, but the Carters accepted that she might not have it in her to admit wrongdoing. Despite that, the spirit of Maplewood Grove felt markedly different now, more open, more supportive. Daniel often joked that Lily, in her toddler innocence, had created the biggest controversy this side of the cul-de-sac. But it was a controversy that ended up forging stronger bonds among neighbors who had once been strangers. Late in the summer, Daniel took Lily outside during a gentle drizzle. Clasping a new box of chalk, he crouched down to scrawl a small swirl on the driveway. Lily squealed, reaching for a piece of bright purple chalk. She scribbled her own toddler version of art, mostly a patchy set of lines that wobbled into unrecognizable shapes. Daniel grinned, watching her, content in the knowledge that she could draw freely without fear of an enraged Karen swooping in to stomp it all away. Across the street, Miss Caldwell waved from her porch, calling out, "Making another maze, Daniel?" Her tone was playful, recalling that fateful day. Daniel called back, "Maybe just a mini one, for Lily's next steps." In that instant, Daniel realized the real power of the labyrinth wasn't in the chalk itself, but in the courage it had inspired. Sometimes, you need something small, like pastel drawings on concrete, to reveal cracks in an oppressive system. Sometimes, you just need a toddler's game to remind everyone that neighborhoods are about people, not just regulations. And so, Maplewood Grove pressed on, a little wiser, a little braver, and carrying with it the memory of how one chalk maze managed to unite families against the overreach of a self-appointed enforcer. In the end, Karen's meltdown had ironically paved the way for a more vibrant and compassionate community, exactly the opposite of what she'd intended. While the chalk labyrinth gradually faded under raindrops and the passing of time, its message remained bright and indelible in everyone's hearts. Long after the sidewalks returned to their normal gray, neighbors would recall the chalk showdown of Maplewood Grove. Children who had participated looked back fondly on the bold patterns, the collaborative spirit, and the knowledge that a single act of neighborliness could inspire positive change. Adults remembered how they found common ground in the face of rigid authority, learning that unity can trump intimidation when good people stand together. Karen, once the unchallenged queen of the HOA, was forever changed by the episode. Though she never publicly apologized, she appeared to patrol less frequently and keep her critiques more subdued. Over time, rumors circulated that she regretted how publicly she had lost. Yet Maplewood Grove's newly established norms made it clear the days of petty tyranny were over. As for Daniel, Heather, and Lily, they continued living in Maplewood Grove with a profound appreciation for the folks who'd stood by them. They held on to a few mementos: photos of Lily's earliest steps through swirling chalk lines, snapshots of the neighbors drawing by flashlight, and a short video of Lily squealing with joy as she toddled through a rainbow path. Every so often, Daniel would place a piece of chalk in Lily's hand, just to watch her delight in scribbling across the driveway, now confident that nobody would come storming over to ruin it. In that sense, the labyrinth never truly disappeared. It lived on in the hearts of everyone who watched colors bloom on a sidewalk and realized that creativity, kindness, and solidarity could triumph over fear and control. And so, the memory of Karen's meltdown was overshadowed by a more powerful legacy, a neighborhood that found its voice through the laughter and wonder of a child's chalk maze.